plants are open systems, like you and I are. You know, we bring in energy from food that we eat, and we release a lot of energy in the form of heat, and some of it disappears in feces and that. And plants, they get their energy from the sun. They make their own sugars, but they also go through cellular respiration, as you know. So they consume oxygen and give off carbon dioxide as waste. And they also produce nitrogenous waste as well. So they get nitrogen from soil or from insects, and then it gets released, sometimes as ammonia. So plants experience energy flow as an open system and nutrient cycling. So plants perform that key step, that initial step of photosynthesis, transforming inorganic molecules, carbon dioxide and water, into sugars. Inorganic to organic substances. It's a nice round word that covers a lot of things. Yeah. What do plants require for energy? Of the sun, of course. Hey, my question to you is, do plants give off heat? Do you think plants give off heat?
Yes.
Yes, they do, because chemical reactions have the byproduct of heat. That's just all there is to it. And that's the random molecular movement, of course, of atoms and molecules and such. So they do give off heat. Indeed, you know, this is really interesting. If, especially this time of year, you'll see, as we talked about last year, last time, I think, skunk cabbage, also known as swamp lantern. But we talked about it in different contexts, didn't we? Oh yeah, reproduction. But the weird and wonderful thing about skunk cabbage is that it erupts out of the snow, even if the ground is snow covered, before a lot of other plants, because it can raise its temperature enough to melt ice and snow around it and emerge out of the soil. It's quite remarkable. Yeah, so plants have that root and shoot system. Plants have roots and plants have shoots. And these are some of the nutrients. The elemental composition of a living organism. What are organisms made of? You know, not just plants, of course. Alfalfa is a plant, but also bacteria, humans that are animals. So this is our composition. Carbon, quite a bit. Hydrogen, oxygen, woohoo, oxygen's way up there, of course. And nitrogen, not so much in plants. Phosphorus, sulfur. And you can remember that by the mnemonic, CHNOPS. Kathy has no other plans Saturday. Forgot about the S. Kathy has no other plans Saturday. So those are the main elements of living organisms. So the question was, back in the days of Aristotle, where does the mass of a plant come from? Plants don't eat like animals do. So where does it come from? How would you test that? How would you do it? If you had to do a study right now, how would you determine where the mass of a plant comes from? Let me ask you this question. What are your choices? What are your choices contributing to the mass of a plant?
Well, we can dry it out first and see what's the percentage of water first.
Great. Okay. Determine water. Good. And so now you've got this dry, dehydrated portion. How will you determine what's in there? Nowadays, we just put it through the mass spectrometer. Right? We have easy ways of doing it, but yeah. One thing that I don't think anybody thought of in Aristotle's day, and even later than that, was that, maybe the plants get something from the air. Now, how would you know that? So this is Vaughn Helmuts' experiment. A bit messed up, not that messed up, I don't think, but maybe a little. So this is what the before picture was like. He took a 5-pound willow sapling. So a willow is a tree and it grows along riverbanks. And he took 200 pounds of dirt. And this is day 1. So what happened? 5 years later, the plant is 169 pounds and 3 ounces. The dirt is 199 pounds, 14 ounces, a 0.00063 decrease in weight. Very small decrease, really. A 3,400% increase in weight of the plant. So quite an increase in weight. Where did it come from? Well, he concluded that the plant material came from water because he dried it up and saw that, there's a lot of water in that plant. But he didn't know that the air had any mass. He ignored that little 2-ounce difference. And he did not also recognize the minerals that were in the soil at that time. So what do plants need? Well, they have these 2 completely different kinds of systems. They've got this root system that's in the soil, and they've got a shoot system that's in the air. Those couldn't be more opposite mediums. So the nutrients from the air are, of course, carbon dioxide, and the plant releases oxygen. And carbon dioxide diffuses through the leaves, through the stomata. Did you see stomata in the lab? The underside of the leaves with the guard cells and all that?
I saw them, yeah.
Okay, I think there was one slide that showed them. There's it's just a pore basically in the plant, the bottom of the leaves. Sometimes they're super obvious. Like with silver fir, there are 2 white lines under each needle, and those are the stomata. They're very obvious, but sometimes they're not so obvious. And they have guard cells, and the guard cells are turgid. The pore closes. And that's when the plant is conserving water. Yeah, so roots through mycorrhizae, we'll talk about those. Those are really neat fungi. And root hairs, which increase the surface area, absorb water and minerals from the soil. Water is released from leaves. That's called transpiration. And you can often determine the rate of a plant's growth by measuring transpiration with special equipment. So macronutrients are required in large quantities. From water and air, carbon, 45%, oxygen, 45%, hydrogen, 6%. That's from water and air. From soil and fertilizer, you're getting nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, magnesium, calcium. Those are all nutrients that the plant needs. Sorry, you're going to have to make up another mnemonic to include all the new things. C. Hopkins, calcium, magnesium. I can't make one up on the spur of the moment. So, yeah, what does the plant need the carbon, the oxygen, the hydrogen for? Well, of course, carbohydrates, it's sugars, starch, cellulose that you mentioned, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. It also needs nitrogen for proteins, of course. They have nitrogen. Amino acids have the amine group, which is nitrogen, phosphorus and nucleic acids, and ATP, of course. Potassium is a catalyst. It also assists in ion transport. And we'll look at that with the uptake of nutrients from soil. It's very interesting because, a lot of soil is clay, and clay is negatively charged, and that has implications when it comes to taking up nutrients from the soil. Yeah, sulfur, of course, in amino acids, it forms those really strong disulfide bridges in proteins. Magnesium is a substance of chlorophyll, so very instrumental in photosynthesis. And calcium is a cell wall component, for example. And those are macro, but just like animals, yeah, just like animals, they call them micronutrients. We could call them micronutrients as well, I guess. But in anatomy and physiology, we call them trace elements. Iron, you need your iron, of course. It gets transported, it transports oxygen through your blood. Well, plants need iron as well. It's part of the process of chlorophyll synthesis. Plant can't do photosynthesis without chlorophyll. Manganese, it activates enzymes. Boron is a cell wall component. These are all very important micronutrients, of course. Chlorine is instrumental in photosynthesis. Zinc, a cofactor, activates enzymes. Copper is a component of enzymes. And molybdenum, no, molybdenum, yeah, molybdenum. It's involved in nitrogen fixation, which is a very important process in that a lot of nitrogen, especially N2, which is from the air, well, it's basically useless for plants. It has to be fixed into other nitrogen types. So an essential element, just like the fatty acids and the amino acids that you talked about in your reports, they're required for growth and development in plants. And the thing about an essential element in plants is that no other element can be substituted. So that's a different meaning, really. It's necessary for a very specific structure and for a very specific function. So we know how nutrient deficiencies can affect humans. What if you have a deficiency in iron? You get tired, you get anemia. If you have a deficiency in iodine, you get possibly a goiter. How do nutrient deficiencies affect plants? And how can we experiment and find that out? So here's an experiment. This is a normal plant with copper added. And this is a hydroponics experiment in water. So there can't be any exacerbating types of nutrients, minerals, or anything added. It's carefully controlled. This is no copper added. So you can see the plant here is like shriveled, not growing in a healthy way. you can prevent the symptoms of just 0.002 milligrams of copper. That's a very small amount. And all essential nutrients have essentially been studied in plants, at least in agricultural plants, maybe not all the plants in the world, of course. But it can tell you which elements are actually essential nutrients. You grow them in solutions, various minerals are dissolved in known concentrations, and if the absence of a mineral like potassium, for example, causes a plant to become abnormal, then you're comparing it to the control, then that element is considered to be essential. So here's a solution containing all minerals, this one here, and this one is a solution that lacks potassium. What's happened to the plant? It hasn't grown and it's yellowed. So you want, the goal, I guess, is that you want to be able to look at your crops and be able to see what your deficiencies are. Sure, you can test them, but if you're growing crops, even if you're growing them at home, you'd like to know what your plants are deficient in, sometimes just by looking at them. So there are some symptoms. It depends on the function of that nutrient. So magnesium is an ingredient of chlorophyll. If chlorophyll isn't present, chlorophyll is a green pigment, then the leaves will yellow. That's called chlorosis. So here you can see, this is a nice green plant, nice and green, this one here. This one, not so much. This one, not so much. So you can ensure optimal mineral nutrition by growing them hydroponically. You're probably thinking that already. Why don't you just grow them all hydroponically? Why not? You can regulate it very well. It is practiced commercially, but it's quite labor intensive and it takes a lot of equipment and it's relatively expensive. Nevertheless, it's quite common. So where do nutrients come from? I think that, well, one of my favorite characters in Charlie Brown was Pigpen, because he was always surrounded by dust and dirt. And I don't know about you, but when you were a kid, maybe you like to play in the mud and the dirt. I still like it. I go through Stanley Park and I just love it when it's muddy. And a couple of courses I was on, we dug a soil pit. So we dug right into the soil to see what the horizons were. Soil is very particular and it depends on a lot of things. So where does soil come from in the first place? Well, the very origin, I guess, are particles that are eroded from rock. So breakdown of rock. So that starts to happen. So in the soil, you'll find gravel. You'll also find, and this is important, the size, gravel, greater than 2 millimeters. Sand between 0.02 and 2 millimeters. That can be part of soil. Silt, much finer, 0.002 to 0.2 millimeters. And clay is less than 0.002. So we're going from the largest to the smallest particles. We're talking about the main components, the inorganic components of soil. That's what we're looking at. And of course, it's very important for plants to have a specific composition, and maybe they evolved in a specific composition. So then, you add water and the particles wash away. Eventually, when you've had some lichens in the system, maybe some mosses, they've died and added organic material. That's your first indication of humus. Humus is what we call the organic decaying layer at the top of soil. In the tropics, it's super thin. Here, it's quite thick. Yeah, decay happens much slower here. Why? It's cold. Yeah, so the mosses and the fungi, they break down and they make the organic part, the humus, decomposed organic matter. And then, of course, there is a ton of living organisms in the soil. You take up a handful, and I can't even tell you how much there would be in there, but definitely millions and millions of bacteria and loads of nematodes and tons of beetles, lots of larvae, mites, tardigrades, you name it. You'd find all kinds of stuff in there. So the elements in the soil are found as ions. And I wanted to make this point because this is clay. Oh, that's blue. I didn't mean to go blue. It's orange, orangish. That's clay. And look at this, clay is a negatively charged substance. And so it attracts positively charged ions to it. The negative ion.
Clay is negatively charged? Oh, sorry, excuse me.
Clay.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah.
Totally. Clay. Yeah. Clay is negatively charged. Yeah. And so that has a couple of implications. The positive ions bind to the clay. So you're probably thinking, well, if that's happening, how is the plant getting the positive ions if it's being attracted to the clay? So there is a way that plants do that, which is very interesting. Other anions are chlorides, phosphates, nitrogen, nitrates. So quite a few negatively charged ions in soil. They're dissolved, so they tend to leach out with the rain. That just basically means the rain washes it out. And then when it washes out of the soil that's usable for the plant, it can wash it into the bedrock underneath where it's no longer available. So, yeah. Positive ions, cations, potassium, calcium. Those are all requirements, but how is the plant going to get them? You never know. So here is a soil pit, or at least somebody's dug something out here to show the various layers of soil. And they're called horizons. And different people give them different names. So there can be, for example, a humus horizon. They sometimes just call them A, B, and C. But what's important is that there's an organic layer, and it's always at the top, of course. But a lot of those organic particles get leached down. What's important is how the soil binds ions, how much oxygen is available, and how far the roots can penetrate into the soil. And sometimes you can tell other things, like there was a smelter for steel, I would imagine, and that's pollution or mine tailings or something like that in the 1800s. You can test the chemical composition, which ions are present. Also, very importantly, of course, if it's an acid soil or an alkaline soil. So that will determine what can grow there. Why is that? All right. Nutrients. Decomposed organic matter. And we looked at ions that are in soil. And of course, the plants need to contract the ions. They need to take the ions up. So what affects nutrient availability is the texture of the soil. If it's a lot of clay, then a lot of the negative ions won't or will be sequestering the positive ions. So that will make a difference to how much nutrients that the plants can take up. The amount of oxygen, that's really important, of course. Oxygen, which supplies what the plant needs for cellular respiration. And how far the roots can penetrate into soil. So there, we had two different kinds of roots, didn't we? Monocots and dicots. We had tap roots and fibrous roots. Yeah. And of course, what the soil is composed of. Is it organic matter? Is there a lot of water? You know, there's plants that can withstand lots of water, really saturated soil. And there's some plants that can withstand really dry environments. How do the ions get inside the root? Well, there's two ways. There's passive uptake and there's active uptake. Of course, if something is taking up an ion against its gradient, it's got to be active uptake. And for that purpose, plants have proton pumps. It requires energy, and a proton pump, in this case, pumps hydrogen. And when the hydrogen is out there, it can passively go back into another channel. And in this case, it's a co-transporter for potassium. So that's one way in which potassium gets into a cell. How do plants keep poisonous ions out? Well, plants live in sometimes very saline conditions. In this case, these are mangroves here and other small shrubs. I don't know what they're called, but they're on the bank of the ocean, and there's a lot of salt there. So the sand is saturated with salt. The soil is saturated with salt because the water is constantly washing up, leaving or evaporating and leaving the salt behind. So there's a lot of salt. And salt tolerance varies in plants. I mean, if you have a house plant, you can kill it with salt quite easily if you added too much. But there are salt tolerant plants. Why are they tolerant? They just have fewer sodium channels. So they take up less. What do plants do if toxic ions get in? So we use plants for that purpose, called bioremediation. Like in Stanley Park, for example, they've got a whole area of swampy plants, and their whole purpose in life, well, their purpose for us in life is to absorb some toxins that come from the causeway, the Stanley Park Causeway. So they do take up toxins. They can actively exclude them with a lack of channels, or in this case, once they're inside, they have metal binding proteins. Those are also known as chelators. So if you were to get, for example, mercury poisoning, you might go to the hospital. What they would do is give you a chelator. Some people think that you can just eat cilantro, and that is a myth. There would never be enough of a chelator in cilantro to help mercury poisoning. So the uptake of anything from the soil, of course, depends on surface area. Surface area. And roots, as you know, have root hairs. And root hairs increase the surface area of roots. How much? Well, say you had a root hair, it's 3 millimeters long, 10 micrometers in diameter. A root itself is 1 millimeter in diameter, and there's 180 root hairs per millimeter of root. How much do root hairs increase the surface area of Arabidopsis? That's one of our fast plants. Well, you take the surface area of the root and the surface area of the 180 hairs, and you come up with eventually 5.5 times more surface area. So quite a lot. When there's heavy rain, what can happen is water drains away from larger spaces, but smaller spaces retain water, and largely because of its attraction for the soil particles, which have electrically charged surfaces. Some water adheres so tightly to hydrophilic particles that it can't be extracted by plants, but some water that's less tightly bound can be absorbed by the roots. So here's a soil particle. It's surrounded by water, a root hair, water that's available to the plant, and airspace. Why is airspace important for roots? Why is airspace important?
Allows them to grow freely.
Mm-hmm.
More freely, not entirely freely.
That is a good point. Yeah, I never thought of that actually. That, yeah, the roots can grow through it probably more easily maybe than clay. Yeah, well, which has more oxygen? A looser kind of gravel situation or tightly packed kind of clay situation?
True. I didn't think of that. Yeah, loosely packed.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, they do say two heads are better than one. Somebody said that. Yes. So in this case, we've got something different going on. So our soil particle here is clay, negatively charged clay. And these particles, the potassium, the copper, the magnesium, the calcium, they're all hanging on to the clay. So how is it displaced? Well, when carbon dioxide is released, because the roots are going through cellular respiration just like the rest of the plant, then the carbon dioxide combines with water. It becomes carbonic acid. The carbonic acid dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen. And then the hydrogen gets attracted to the soil and displaces some of the positive ions that are sequestered onto the clay. That's another way in which the positive ions can be released from the clay and be made available to the plants. So mycorrhizal fungi, very important. It increases the surface area of roots a lot. So when you look at the root system underneath the ground, there's a lot of mycorrhizal activity down there. It looks like a fungus that might be affecting the plant adversely, but it's not. It's just increasing the surface area of the plant. Yeah. And that's a symbiotic relationship. The fungus provides phosphorus to the plant. The plant provides sugar to the fungus. How can you test that hypothesis? How can you test that this is actually a symbiotic relationship? Well,
Because neither is dying.
Sorry, Edward?
Because neither is dying.
Yeah.
If one of the two was dying, then it would be a parasitic relationship. But since they're both
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so there are plants that are parasitic on other plants, for sure, like the translucent pipe plants that grow on roots, and what's it called? Dwarf mistletoe that grows on branches and sucks nutrients right out of the plant. So yeah, they are parasitic symbionts. Exactly. Yeah. You could also use radioisotopes. So plants take up isotopes when they're taking up carbon dioxide for cellular respiration. Carbon-14, for example, you can see it because it decays like radioisotopes do on film. And isotopes emit radiation, so you can see the isotopes. So what this experiment did was feed radioactive carbon dioxide, so with carbon-14, in the plant's environment, and radioactive phosphorus and nitrogen in the root system. So the carbon dioxide is absorbed by the plant, it's indicated by red. Phosphorus and nitrogen absorbed by fungi. We're just hypothesizing, where does it end up? Well, we can trace the phosphorus and nitrogen that the roots took up that end up in the leaves and the body of the plant. And of course, we can find the carbon down in the roots. Symbiotic relationship. So mycorrhizal fungi are very important. They're also what is a crucial part of plants, particularly legumes, peas, beans, and alfalfa, are nitrogen fixing bacteria. So nitrogen in the atmosphere is N2, the gas, not available, but bacteria can fix it to ammonia. And then further bacteria convert ammonia to other things that the plant can also use. And some plants can use ammonia. So these are the roots of a soybean plant. These are root nodules here and here. And those house the bacteria, the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They're protected by the root nodules from the surrounding environment.
Sorry, that 90% of plants, yes, the first one says 90% of plants. Does that mean that 90% of the phosphorus found in plants is provided by the I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it.
Yes, mycorrhizal.
Mycorrhizal.
Mycorrhizal fungi.
Thank you.
Yeah, yes,
Oh.
yeah. So the main thing that the mycorrhizal fungi is providing to the plants is the phosphorus. The main thing that the nitrogen-fixing bacteria is providing to the plant is nitrogen. So two of the really super, super important nutrients. Yeah, so there's some very unusual adaptations of plants. Epiphytes. Epi means above, phyte is plant. Those are plants that live on other plants. And they just absorb nutrients that's in the rainwater and dust and the air. They're not parasites. They just get greater access to sunlight. There's also parasitic plants. This is the pipe, Indian pipe. It's white. So just by its color, you can tell it doesn't photosynthesize. So where does it get its nutrients from? From the roots. This is the mistletoe. And then there's carnivorous plants that we talked about before too. The Venus flytrap gets nitrogen from insects. And this is a pitcher plant. And those are sundews. We have sundews around here. And you'll probably see them in the next little while. There will be some sundews coming up.
And sorry, one more time. Before, I think you mentioned that carnivorous plants are carnivorous because they need the nitrogen, and the only way they can get it is through other organisms. Is that right? No? Am I making it up?
Sorry, repeat that. Sorry.
I'm not quite sure if before you said that carnivorous plants are carnivorous because they need a higher supply, so to speak, of nitrogen, and the only way they can get it is through other organisms.
Yes.
Is that right? Okay.
That is right. Yeah. And a lot of plants can't take up ammonia, or sometimes soil is really acidic, so they can't access it. And like bogs. So that's where you find sundew. That's this one here. This is a round sundew. Okay. Yeah, it has these sticky ends. You know, they look like, ooh, nice water or nectar or something for an insect, but it's not sticky. So the insect gets stuck, and then the disc just folds around.
And is the whole body of the organism digested, or just the plant just sucks in the nutrients that it needs, and it just gets rid of the rest of the body? That sounds terrible.
Yeah, it just gets rid of the rest. Yeah.
Okay.
It just dries up. Basically, they dry up and just waft away on the wind, basically. Yeah. Okay. So the pitcher plant, which is here, it has water inside, full of enzymes, digestive enzymes. And those enzymes digest whatever falls in there. Yeah, and the fly trap, it releases enzymes as well and digests the insect. And then when it opens up, the insect is just a husk, a dry husk. Yeah. And the sundews as well, they'll fold over, release enzymes, absorb the nutrients from the insect, and then they'll open up again, and all that will be left will be a little dry insect. So once I took a bunch of sundews from a little bog thing that I had, to elementary schools. Well, one elementary school. I did a practicum at an elementary school. That's a long time ago. And the kids thought it was so cool. They kept feeding it or trying to feed it all these mosquitoes and other things. It was completely covered in mosquitoes and flies. They thought they could put it on the plant and, it would absorb it. But, it doesn't really need that much. Yeah. So are differences in plant growth genetic or environmental? This may be important for your assignments. I'm not really sure what you're doing, but how can you set up an experiment? Well, let's see. We've got plant types a plant type A and a plant type B. And they're grown in two soil types, same conditions. Are the differences environmental or genetic? So here is on the y-axis height. And here is the different environments. So here's A and B. This is sandy soil. Here on this side, sandy soil, and this is potting soil. So looking at that, how can you tell that the difference in height is due to genetics or due to the environment? Interpret the graph.
I'm sorry, what's the second graph? What is it recording? The first
Okay,
one
so,
is the
sorry.
sandy soil, but
Yeah, so this is the height of pea plants. But here we've got sandy soil and potting soil. We've got plant A and plant B. They're growing in this type of soil. And in this case, they're both growing in potting soil. So different kinds of soil and two different plants. And in this case, we've got the two different plants growing in sandy soil and the two different plants growing in potting soil.
oh, okay. I
So
thought I
which
was
one?
perfect.
Which one is genetic? It's this one, right? Because it doesn't matter what soil it's in, they grow to the same height, regardless of the soil type. Yeah, but in this one, growth is due to environmental factors. They both grow taller in potting soil. Does that make sense? The graph needed to be explained better, sorry. It's an experiment. A lot goes on in soil. This is Calvin and Hobbes. You ever read Calvin and Hobbes? No? Comic? I read it in university. Hobbes like, why are you digging a hole? I'm looking for buried treasure. What have you found? A few dirty rocks, a weird root, and some disgusting grubs. On your first try, there's treasure everywhere. There is. So we talked earlier a little bit about agriculture and how we are changing sometimes the environment. Really, it takes centuries for a soil to become fertile through the breakdown of soil and the accumulation of organic material, with no outside disturbance. But with humans can mismanage it and can destroy soil fertility very, very quickly. It's a fairly common thing. So one that you might have heard of happened a long time ago. I think the grapes of wrath was based on it. Years of drought, losing a topsoil that was blown away. Yeah, so this was the, I think, what are they called again? In California, the Badlands? Eek, I used to know that, I don't remember. But so what happened here was they were grasslands. Grasslands with grass adapted to the soil and the wind. So the grass provided a buffer against the wind and retained the soil there. And that had a cyclic effect for water and the presence of water and nutrients, of course, as well. But then I suppose because people figured, well, grass already grows there, why don't we grow something else like wheat or whatever? And they planted it, but it did not hold on to the soil. So the soil just drifted away on the wind. And it was also because of drought, of course. It just got drier and drier and drier and drier. But the local plants would have experienced drought in the past and would have adapted to it. But sometimes agricultural plants do not. So we lose a lot of topsoil to wind and water every year, but you can reduce it. There are ways of planting. So you can plant rows of trees between fields as a windbreak, for example. You can terrace a hillside. So this is terracing with different layers, different heights of plants. So that prevents the topsoil from washing away. Alfalfa and wheat provide good ground cover and protect soil better than, say, corn. Maybe that's what was planted in that area before it was corn. Yeah. So there are ways of growing crops to preserve soil and to prevent erosion. All right, we'll stop there. Thank you for watching.